from My Perfect Failure, helping you turn your failures into successes and your setbacks into opportunities. Can we really train ourselves to grow stronger in the face of fear and adversity? On today's episode of My Perfect Failure, I'm joined by Dr. Nick, Holton and Dr. Adam Wright, co-founders of the Antifragile Academy. Born from a crisis and rooted in science, their work is helping people from students to CEOs develop the mindset and tools to face life challenges head on. We discuss the powerful concept of anti-fragility, why it's more than just resilience, how it connects deeply with flourishing, and how it empowers us to see challenges as springboards for growth. We also explore what peak performance really means and why a high achiever isn't always a happy one. This episode reminded me that setbacks don't have to be stop signs, they can be stepping stones if we're equipped to face them. So press play and discover how to thrive through adversity.
Who knows what Jay-Z, J.K. Rowling, Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey all have in common? Okay, I will tell you then. They have all overcome failure in one shape or form to go on to gain success in their respective careers. Welcome to My Perfect Failure. Join us as we delve into the world of our perfect failures. We will interview, explore and discuss how our perfect failures can lead us to success. Join us and tune in.
Welcome everybody to another episode of My Perfect Failure. Today I'm super excited because I have not one, but I have two amazing guests for you today. So firstly, we have Dr. Nick Holton. Nick focuses on helping individual, teams, businesses and organizations become better versions of themselves through the application of cutting-edge science of human flourishing, a synergistic development of both peak performance and overall well-being and fulfillment. Nick currently serves as a private coach and consultant working with individuals and groups ranging from professionals and athletes for the NCAA programs. He also runs a podcast alongside the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. And we've also got joining us today, Dr. Adam Wright, who is a high performance and executive coach, consultant and educator who supports a broad range of performers whose craft demands their absolute best in volatile, high stakes environments. His clients range from elite high school, collegiate and professional athletes to Fortune 100 corporate leaders, professionals in military and law enforcement and creatives from the entertainment world. He consults in such disparate performance arenas as the front office of the NFL, the MLB, the European PGA, MLS, Hollywood and Wall Street. Wow. And he currently serves as a major league mental performance coach for the Washington Nationals. Together, Dr. Holton and Dr. Wright are the co-founders of Antifragility, training the art of not just surviving, but thriving in the face of challenges. So a very warm welcome to you guys to My Perfect Failure. How are you both?
Very good.
Doing well, thanks. Yeah, thank you for having us.
Well, thank you for being here. Super excited, not just to have one of you. It'd be amazing to have one of you, but I've got both of you here today. So
be careful what you ask for, Paul. I'm not too sure about that one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anti-fragility definitely sticks out. I've been listening to some of your content today, and it's wonderful content. So I'm actually going to put some of the content in the show notes, not mine, but others as well, just because it was super interesting and informative. But what I thought is a good place to start, you both have got these very rich careers and in performance and anti-fragility, performance in sports world, and also to help people flourish. So you could be doing things individually, but you kind of like collaborated together. So how did you guys initially meet? I don't think he wants to take that one.
Yeah, we met, we had both been hired by a different organization that kind of exists in the quote unquote peak performance world. We got hired around the same time, really in really similar ways where they sort of reached out to us. We had been working, doing similar things in similar spaces, and so both kind of got plucked, as you might say, and before you knew it, we were kind of put into a group setting with a group of police officers here in the United States who were going through some of this training, and we were in a support capacity where we'd be working with some of these officers one-on-one on some of these group calls together. And I think the kind of shared timeline, along with sort of the immediate immersion into some meaningful and important work there, I think kind of bonded Adam and I early on. And then just sort of coincidentally, I think we quickly found, shared set of values, shared set of interests, overlapping backgrounds, yet distinct. And so, things just kind of blossomed from there, and we would end up kind of starting the Anti-Fragile Academy a couple of years later, really not much longer than that later, once Adam had moved on from that organization, and I was just about to.
Okay.
And
Okay.
look, I add an element to this in terms of the catalyst. I think that really did spur that decision, which we were talking about and playing with ideas. But there was a time, and like I forget what it was, maybe it was like a year or two ago. It was when 5 NCAA college athletes in the U.S. committed suicide. And I felt like that really was a hinge moment where we said, okay, something needs to be done proactively, where these athletes are underserved, and how can we contribute at scale to, largely democratizing this content and information so it's more accessible to people who need it, how and when they need it.
Okay. Well, that's a very compelling reason to think, actually, let's focus on seeing what we can do, particularly when there's clearly a problem when you get young athletes that come to the conclusion that taking their life is the only option they have, which is a pretty grim situation. Anti-fragility. Up until 3 days ago, I'd never heard of the word, but I've listened to a lot of content around it. But it would be lovely to understand, definitely for people that aren't like me, aren't familiar with it. What is anti-fragility?
Go ahead, Nick. I feel like you sum this up efficiently.
Yeah, well, so I think and this is somewhat connected really to Adam and I's backgrounds, but kind of the why behind why we came together. So you've got to appreciate kind of this distinction. And I was just talking to a group at San Francisco PD about this last week. So if you can appreciate thinking of mental health or languishing or flourishing, right, kind of on this spectrum, historically, we've had sort of this break fix model, right? If something is quote unquote wrong, something is really bad, say with an individual, we might react to that through, variety of different measures. And we might also call the ability of that person to sort of rebound from some of those things, their levels of resilience, right? But it is really a capacity that is reactive, primarily, right? Reactive and fixing something bad or unpleasant. So part of my background, and Adam exists in these spaces a little bit as well, is, all right, let's think about how we might proactively, and here's we get human flourishing and positive psychology and a lot of fields that have existed well before either of those, who are asking really critical and interesting questions of how do you build the good, well-being, high performance, general satisfaction, meaning and purpose, right? And in the midst of all of that, you get, I think, a little confusion that turns into things like toxic positivity and just sort of like manifesting good things, and poof, stuff's just going to show up, and a little kind of on the woo and overly pleasant side. And so Adam and I are looking at all of this and kind of saying, listen, there's a both and here, right? Like we're missing something, and the both and is skills and capacities that help people react and recover, certainly. But how do we help more people get on the front foot, to use some soccer terminology, and be more proactive about building the good. Yeah, let's not throw that out, but also intentionally taking on hard or difficult or unpleasant to steel themselves. And in a roundabout way, that's where we come back to your question. That's anti-fragility. It's taking the idea of
Okay.
proactively building a thriving life, but that doesn't mean pleasantness exclusively. And it acknowledges what is important about us trying to intentionally take on unpleasant things, meaningful, right? But unpleasant things that help us grow, help steel us, help us prepare for the inevitable adversities we're going to have to react to at some point in life.
Okay.
And I think the important part to this, particularly coming out of the performance psychology world, we're teaching skills often to make people more mentally tough, and they might be biological, they might be psychological, they might be emotional, they might be social, relational. But to me, there was never a kind of a meta theory. Like anti-fragility for me created, it was almost emergent property of what we do naturally, right? We train our muscles and what happens? Take a little time off and they get stronger. Something I feel like that's part of who we are, this idea, their ability to super compensate after stress. If we get out of the way and let that happen, but society throws us curveballs and chaos and ambiguity such that it just gets in the way. And this was a wonderful way to conceptualize what we're trying to actually do to a life of thriving and flourishing, take on tough things, high challenges, but with a lot of support, with tools in our toolbox, with intention to approach them proactively, right? And to grow from them. And something different than I was doing in general sports psychology, which was very much just that break fix perspective.
No, it sounds really interesting, really compelling, but also feels like something that we all need and we don't have that ability, that foundational robustness to cope with the curveballs that get thrown at us every day. It can be anything. It can be an email. It can be like a bad review at work, or in sport, it could be maybe we're not getting picked for our baseball team or our football team, and
Or an injury.
Yes.
or an
Yep.
injury,
Yes.
or an injury. So, from your perspective, is it anti-fragility? Is it giving people that sort of that muscle memory that we get those tools where we just have that the inner ability to cope with the inevitable challenges that we're going to have in different aspects of our lives?
Cope with and adapt to and even learn from or grow from.
Okay,
Yes.
that's rich. I love that.
Yeah. What we also want to make clear, though, is that doesn't mean, impervious to unpleasantness, right? Like you can cope with it. You can adapt to it. You can learn to leverage it. What we don't encourage is avoidance or suppression or rigidity, right? That sometimes gets associated with, say, Adam used the term earlier, like mental toughness, right? Or something along those lines. And so there's an inherent, I think, flexibility to how one, like I said, adapts to and sort of learns to leverage these changing, uncertain, volatile, ambiguous, difficult situations.
The idea is not to have the tough moments or avoid the feelings that come along with those tough moments. It's the reframing of those tough moments to look at the pressure as an opportunity, to look at adversity as a challenge. It's an opportunity for growth, right? So now you're taking these setbacks on, but not only that, but you're embracing them such that we know we're going to get stronger day to day, year to year. But we're doing it not just a philosophical concept like Stoicism. It's kind of what Stoicism is philosophical concept. But we're saying, no, these are actionable strategies based upon the latest science, both psychology, neuroscience, and so forth, to help move us forward. And we're trying to put it in a curriculum so people can learn it. And yes, like muscle memory, there's a level of automaticity. Once you get better at this and do more reps, you get better at handling tougher and tougher stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you were talking, and something that immediately comes into my head, and it's possibly it's a reflection on me. Sometimes when those tough moments, we know that they're upon us. If I can, or if we can, sometimes it's easier to think, well, is there a way that I don't have to engage that? I can maybe find a way through, which kind of means that I'm not going to grow, develop, or even confront what I need to confront to move forward. Is that a challenge or an issue that you see in your, I guess, in your interaction with clients?
You take this one, Adam.
Yeah. So if I were to ask you what you think the number one barrier to growth is, personally, professionally, what might that be? And from an action perspective.
Probably non-action, maybe. Is it?
Right. Avoidance. Yeah, 100%. And that avoidance comes in three forms. Yeah. Emotional, it comes in cognitive, and it comes in behavioral forms. Right. And we need to address that. And underlying all that is a fear, right? Ultimately, that's the engine that fears us, whether it's fear of failure, fear of discomfort, fear of judgment, which is a big one, particularly, and the idea is we have to address this head on. But if we just kind of push it down and try to repress it, it's going to rear its ugly head at some point. It's going to bite you in the tail, and it's going to come. It's going to come up one way or another, whether we like it or not. So why not be honest and transparent with ourselves and approach it from a place of strength and with agency?
Is there a degree of, because to me, I love this concept because it almost, to me, it aligns with this podcast, My Perfect Failure, which is the idea that, to me, is the idea that there's always opportunities in difficult moments. So when we have a failure, invariably, it can be viewed, and I definitely have over the years viewed it as pretty terminal. But actually, I think that people that invariably that I admire, they've got that technique where they go into the detail, they look at the new information they didn't have before, and then they use that as a runway to move forward. With anti-fragility, particularly with people, probably adults my age and maybe a little bit younger, and as we get older, is there a degree of unlearning those old behaviors that people like me have had over the years?
Keep going, Adam.
So my perspective is twofold, right? I would train clinically and I would train as academic sports psychology. So, the big thing in the clinical idea is that we create these narratives, right? That we buy in as truths, right? And part of this process is using evidence-based techniques like acceptance, commitment, and others that tell us that we can have these theories, but they don't necessarily have to drive our life. So we create some separation and recognize what's serving us well and what's not serving us well. It's not right or wrong. It's not bad or good. And if those old narratives and ways of doing things and actions that we take based on the past are no longer serving us, then we have the opportunity to change. That change doesn't mean moving forward without fear. It means moving forward because of fear, because you can't have courage without fear. Right. So the idea is then we're making value-based decisions on who you want to be, what you value, and your principles, and where you want to go. And then we're creating a new narrative and taking action, along with and because of that new narrative. Yes. Does it take training? Yeah. Just like reps. Look at it this way. If you want to train a new motor pattern, it takes about 400 reps based upon a motor learning literature. It takes about 4,000 reps to layer another one over top of that. And by the way, you never get rid of that initial pattern. Think about what you've been doing for 30 years of your life as a pattern. How long is that going to take to overcome and to work? This takes a lot of work, but a lot of it's creating a new narrative and a new way of conceptualizing the world and a new mindset. And Nick, were you going to say something? I thought you were. Oh, okay.
And sure. And again, what I see in that is opportunity. I would imagine that when you're engaging, maybe not just engaging clients, but people that are listening to this, if we think about areas of our lives that maybe we're not where we want to be, and it could be within sport, it could be maybe we're a senior manager within a business, it could be anything. Invariably, I think you mentioned fear. There's invariably a fear, a blocker that's stopping us from moving forward. And because I don't know this, but I guess I'm thinking of me again. I think sometimes deep down we know what the part of the problem might be, and it's a lack of action. It's a lack of actually confrontation of whatever that situation is. And I think this, to me, is a lovely conduit to get us on that road to actually confronting. And I guess ultimately, further on down the line, there are, I would imagine, quite significant rewards. I know, Nick, that you look at flourishing as well. So with anti-fragility and flourishing, when you're working with clients looking at anti-fragility, is flourishing part of the program as well, part of that support mechanism, or are they two different disciplines?
I mean, I think they're probably related. We are making arguments that they are related. In terms of our programming, absolutely we're treating them as if they're related. And that's because if you go back to sort of, Nassim Taleb's original definition, what we're talking about is really thriving in the face of, or even because of, some of these adversities, right? And so on just kind of just simple, like thinking about that core definition, if you're going to develop the capacity to thrive through difficult circumstances, the first step is you better know what it means to thrive. And that's, kind of a simple idea, but it's complicated, or I should say it's complex for each individual. We know a ton about sort of like the biggest indicators of what generally leads to a good life, even in some cases across cultures, although a lot of this stuff is certainly studied on monoculture, let's say, to put it simply. But that's still going to be left up to like deep personalization, right? And individual values and some of the other things Adam is bringing up. And so in some cases, going back to that spectrum, we might work with an individual who's a little bit more, they need some help with resilience right now. They're trying to get from -5 to 0. They're trying to feel a little better, content, healthier. A good example would be to mitigate burnout, right? We might have another client who is maybe at that 0 and they're starting to think about fortifying through anti-fragility and really building more of a thriving existence as opposed to just a content one. In either case, we would want that individual or that team or that group to have tools and capacities on both sides of that spectrum, right? Because it's really about taking on and navigating those difficult things, ultimately in service of a rich, meaningful, kind of fulfilling, thriving life.
Yeah. So does it start with for people that are listening to this, are thinking, actually, there's something I want to definitely explore, to people that you've worked with and working with? Does it start with that recognition of what the challenge is, and you deal with maybe what the underlying challenges is, and you start building the tools that you're going to need to become more resilient, more willing to engage those challenging moments, and then you can get, once you do the work, that continuous work that, to Adam's point, requires reps. You can't. There's no. I guess there's no magic wand where we just sprinkle some gold dust and we're there. But then once we do the work, then we can, I guess, over a period of time, we see the reward, and then we can get to that point where we're starting to flourish in different areas of our lives.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
the last phrase is an important one, like different areas of our lives. Because, if you were to take, so there's a common exercise you might do with somebody at the start of conversations like this, and simply you would give people, let's say, the different ingredients of what generally contributes to high life satisfaction, thriving. We can conceptualize it different ways, but, they would rate it on a scale of, say, 0 to 10. Right. And in some of those cases, some of those areas are going to be 7s and 8s, which are typically high score on a scale 0 to 10, because not many people are saying 9s and 10s. Not many people are saying this area of my life couldn't improve. So 7 and 8, like being pretty high on these scales, whereas other areas might be down 2s, 3s, 4s, those sorts of things, right? So one of the first steps is, okay, where are the areas where they're going really well, and we might need to just try to make sure we stay focused on maintaining those. There might be other areas where we're looking to improve some of these indicators of flourishing. And inevitably, a lot of that process might involve removing or mitigating or dealing with some of the quote unquote bad, right, or unpleasant. Like it's all going to be very related, right?
And I think if I could add something, that there's a very personal, subjective element to this. For example, ask the question I do this with a lot of my athletes: are you surviving or thriving? And if you look at them on this, or it might be the highest performing athlete on a team from a performance perspective, right? By every measure, they are thriving. But if you scratch below the surface just a little bit, they seem overwhelmed. They might be silently struggling. They're just trying to get through the next day, the next season, right? They are holding on and they are merely surviving. And left long enough with enough constant stress, that surviving goes into a mental health disorder. So the point of this is just because someone's performing at the best in their field, that's the biggest mistake I made when I came out with my doctorate, right? My ego got in the way of this. I was blinded by that. They might not be thriving either in their profession or their personal life. And the idea is we have to look for a foundation of mental health so we can build up that pyramid towards peak performance.
Wow, that's really interesting. It's kind of a bit scary as well that you can seemingly see somebody. We were talking about before we hit the record button, football and stuff like that, and you might see somebody seemingly performing well, but actually that doesn't tell the full story.
Mm-hmm.
with that being said, how, I guess, challenging or difficult or worrying is that if you're maybe somebody's listening to this who maybe manages a team, or they've got manages a team, or they're responsible for teams, what can they do to essentially be on top of this and make sure that their athletes are getting the best possible treatment, not just the physical stuff, which is which is having the physios and the performance people on the pitch, but actually that mental agility stuff that we're talking about now.
I respond to
I
that.
think
If you want to give,
well, I think you should give your perspective, just as a director of a club that's dealing with that. Yeah.
And I also work in soccer this year. I'm working with a female professional team in the States. So I've been both sides, right? Not just baseball. And here's the number one thing that I suggest to all my coaches and managers, right? You need to get to know your athlete as a human being first. If you cannot create an environment of psychological safety, and I know that gets a bad rap sometimes, so it's not about avoiding hard shit or coddling. It's about trust and real connection, right? You will miss it, right? The idea is I do regular check-ins, right? Beyond performance, how you doing? How's your life? How's your family? What's been on your mind, right? These questions. How's life outside of sport? I don't care about. I see what's happening on the pitch. I see what's going on with you. What are you about, right? I want to know what matters most to them. What's going on in your life? What do you really value? I'm making assumptions about what you want to do in the next contract, but I don't know. What is your intrinsic motivation? What drives you here? What motivates you beyond winning? What are your personal values? And I think the other aspect is there has to be more empathy in this process as a leader and as a coach. Sometimes we're way too busy teaching the skills rather than just letting implicit learning happen and doing a lot more listening and leveraging that quiet and say, what do you need? What do you need from me to get better? Where are your deficits? How can I best support you, rather than me constantly telling I need to do a little bit more listening as a leader?
Yeah, that's really interesting as well, because there's a lot more skills that a coach needs, clearly, to essentially understand. Well, there's loads of things that go into my head. There's a lot more skills or competencies that coaches have to make sure that their players' well-being is catered for, but also that, I guess, that would lean into their performance as well, because if you're doing a good job with the mental well-being of your staff, your players, then I would imagine that they're going to, even if they're performing well, they're going to perform even better. I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that. I'll probably direct it at you, Adam, because I think it's your area of expertise.
We're both on it. Nick and I are both doing it. We're working at the same level. He works in pro, and here's a framework that we talk about a lot, right? In terms of this high support and high challenge framework. And one way I've described it to people, the best coaches are liberators. They create a culture of empowerment. They create a culture of opportunity to unlock people, right? The worst environment is that high challenge, low support. And I call those coaches dominators, right? It's a culture of fear. It's a culture of manipulation. It's very transactional. I think everything we need to do as leaders is to push people to that environment of high support, high challenge, which we call facilitative environment in the literature.
Always hesitant to kind of make overly broad claims about like the right paths to high performance, say. But when it comes to the question, and that's why I bring it up, like this question of sort of, is a peak performing player athlete a happy athlete, a mentally healthy athlete, a satisfied athlete? It's really tricky. And I think also, like, a lot of times, no, they are not. Their inherent dissatisfaction or failure to have enough is part of what is driving them to grow, right? And at the same time, Adam and I can both point to very real theories and then very real athletes that suggest there is a tangible sort of like happiness advantage, well-being boost, that most people, generally speaking, perform better across a variety of different areas when they are generally feeling good. And that could mean a lot of different things. Adam mentioned a great term like psychologically safe, right? But there is some, it's not what we would call an unrelenting environment, right? Where there's no support in place, there's insurmountable challenges, there's sort of no collective resilience, if you will. So it's a super, super complicated question, but certainly we can point to tangible theories and I think realistic examples where people perform much better when like duh, they're generally feeling pretty good.
A question that comes to mind, and it's I don't know. So sometimes, particularly again, we spoke about football, soccer before we hit the record button, and my team, Southampton, we recently lost our manager, and that invariably during the course of the season, there's going to be probably, I don't know what the average is, but probably 6 or so managers will lose their job. So the managers are under a lot of pressure. So their performance is continually getting scrutinized and challenged. And I guess what I was thinking that when they're under pressure because the team isn't performing, maybe they're getting challenged by the executives that they're maybe why aren't you performing because the team's not performing. I would imagine there's a domino effect in maybe their ability to maybe coach or manage or maybe look for the subtle signs that maybe they're not being as compassionate to maybe some of the particularly younger athletes that maybe need that. I don't know whether there's any correlation there or maybe or if you have any thoughts on that.
A state of fear is a state of narrowed focus.
Okay.
Like on the most simple level, right? So yeah, I think on some level you can say somebody who is maybe worried about their job, are they going to have a little more trouble, if that's their livelihood, for instance? Maybe in some cases it's not because you mentioned in this case, it's a former player, potentially he's built up a livelihood, probably not, in the line for free meals the next week if he loses his job. But nonetheless, right, if he's still experiencing visceral fear, if that's not experienced, Adam referenced it earlier, as an opportunity or a challenge, it creates a very different physiological profile and reaction, and one that is typically a little tighter, a little more rigid, a little less open, right? More closed off. To me, yes, it certainly would correlate with a lower ability to kind of stay open to the various perspectives and possibilities of what the people around you are experiencing.
Yeah, when you go to self-preservation mode from growth to survival, you get a host of it's a domino effect. You get blinded decision making. You get there ends up an emotional contagion, right? You start to that anxiety is very contagious, right? And you see a reduced presence and connection that happens. It's inevitable, right? It's a fear response, and the idea is how do we best support coaches in this environment too? Coaches need help in this process as well. So when a sports psych comes in the team, everybody thinks it's just for the players. The best team, sports psychology to me is a integral thread in the tapestry of the team. And that science needs to support everyone, every player, staff, locker room attendants, everyone, because we're all experiencing that contagion.
Yeah. I was listening to some of your content yesterday, and I think it aligns to this theme that sometimes you'll get organizations that will think that they're employing maybe performance or they're supporting performance or maybe team well-being, that they're doing something, but in some instances they don't really have the support or the infrastructure there. They're doing some parts of it, but the actual bedrock of support isn't there. So is that something that organizations can look at to ensure that if you want to do this properly, you need to make sure top to bottom you've got the support that your business and your employees need?
So,
yes.
Can I say one thing, Nick? Because I'm laughing. Correlation, we know as scientists, right? Correlation and causation are not the same. It just so happens that I came back from the Major League winter meetings, which is a big thing in the state. A lot of deals get done, right? We were down in Dallas, Texas, right? Every team is represented, and all the mental performance coaches meet as a group. And interestingly, not causation, but those teams with the largest staffs, 6, 7, 8 people, not to give names, but I'll throw one, New York Yankees and so forth, right? Interesting to see that they are perennial, usually one of the best performers in the division. Now, it's not because they have 7 or 8 people on staff, but it's telling me how they approach their assets, right? As people, not just performers. So that to me is indicative. It's showing me
because you're saying there's a ratio, Adam, right? There's a
ratio. Some teams have 1 person or 2. They're checking a box, and inevitably you look at these teams and they're in the bottom quartile every year after year, because it's where they're spending money. whether or not, they value this, but the idea is, how can you not value basic human dignity and mental
Absolutely.
health? It's an absurd conversation, right? To me, if you're having that conversation, it's not about just giving guys more hugs. The idea is that if you can create a better foundation of stability and a sense of integration and safety within the team, they'll perform better too. It's good for the bottom line, right? Not just good for their soul.
And that's why it's such a false economy not to really take a serious look at the level of support that your business needs to have for your staff, particularly in the sports arena.
We think so. And in a lot of arenas for that matter, like we're talking to different clients right now who are, their leadership teams. We call them executive athletes. We work with first responders. We call them tactical athletes. Like, this is anyone that cares about performing at a really high level at what they're doing, especially if what they're doing is like kind of a high burnout profession.
Yeah.
Right. Like, just being very thoughtful and careful about that particular experience of burnout, but also fortifying in ways that are going to contribute potentially to the pressures that come with scaling. If you're a startup or an entrepreneur, the pressures that come with first responders and medical community, like shift work and changing schedules and like literally life or death situations.
So the question that I often have when I'm talking to people about how we can develop ourselves, particularly from a behavioral perspective, and I guess ultimately I'm talking about improving ourselves. With anti-fragility, what type of age do you think that we should start? We need to kind of harness and develop the foundational elements of anti-fragility. I don't know who you want to take that.
The real good research-backed answer is we don't know.
Okay.
That's the right answer.
Yeah.
And let's look at go ahead. I thought you were stopping. Keep going.
It's okay. No, I say the anecdata, if you will. I think if you talk to parents, if you talk to coaches, if you talk to mentors, it's a little bit of a cop-out, as all psychologists' answers are, but it depends. It depends on the individual. When you look at the limited research on this, you've got to take away, I think, key pieces like subjectivity. How difficult or unpleasant or uncertain or ambiguous or fear-inducing an experience is often going to depend on the perception of that individual experiencing it, right? So for parents or coaches listening, I would not advise, say, taking the same sort of approach for helping stealing young kids the same way with the same child. Like, I would, to Adam's point, you really need to know that child, know that athlete, know that employee, whatever it might be. So it's really hard to like pinpoint, let's say, a specific age. I think it's more about what can that individual handle that's just a little outside of that comfort and adaptive zone, kind of piece by piece by piece.
Okay.
And I'm going to step away from that. And I think that was the right answer. And I'm going to give, the anecdotal answer, right? That here's how I look at it. In the States, this is particularly in the States, if I look at depression rates between 13-year-olds and 18-year-olds, it's 15%. Anxiety is about 18%, depending on that's based on our CDC. Once you jump into that next group, when you get up to 18 to 24, it almost doubles. It almost doubles, right? Kids are suffering at an earlier age, pressures are greater. To me, to say a proactive life skills approach to training kids up to deal with the pressures of life, like that we have to have research to support that, is absurd. The research is clear. There are serious mental, and by the way, that is a diagnosable mental health disorder. That doesn't mean kids are thriving. All right. So why not teach people skills to help them deal with the complexities and the pressures of the world? There's no downside to this other than
as long as we're not inducing trauma, right?
That's
like
different.
that's the key. Well, of course it's different.
Right. Obviously, that's a different conversation.
And we just, in terms of the way we're talking on a show like this, and we're always careful to like give advice, but the general rule here is we're talking about in helping a young person at an early age, to Adam's point, learn to take on and navigate different forms of distress, right? And ideally, in a perfect situation, that distress is sort of meaningful. But that doesn't have to be something super serious, certainly not traumatic. I'm thinking of the story and sort of a controversy here in the States about, I think, a woman who let her child walk home from school one day or up the driveway. And people were sort of aghast at, like, oh my goodness, how unsafe this is, and it turned into this conversation about coddling versus sort of empowering, right? And those sorts of things. And so I'd say, like, there's a lot of different simple ways to find those moments of adversity, uncertainty, and challenge. And I personally would make it very explicit, right? If I were starting, like, hey, my child, my player, my client would, like, we're going to do this on purpose. There are going to be times where we're going to take these things on, right? And thinking of a simple example just the other day, for me, the earliest example was like video games. It sounds silly, but like learning to persevere, navigate frustration and anger and stuff like that. Having a moment with my niece where you could go through something similar and just looking for those opportunities, whatever the age, to say, like, okay, this is uncomfortable, but how are we going to use this to our advantage and learn to navigate it and grow from it?
Yeah.
And a very famous social psychologist at NYU, Jonathan Haidt. I don't know if you guys really follow his work. He wrote a book called Coddling of the American Mind. And his argument is very simple. Like, why do we wait till people break or get sick before we teach them cognitive behavioral skills? Why not give them proactively? Like, there's no downside to teaching people skills to deal with hard stuff.
Yeah.
As opposed to waiting till they fall apart and then, okay, now we're going to put you back together. We're going to teach you the skills you should have had to begin with.
Right.
Right. But that does not say we need to understand the individual, because what's a potentially traumatic event for one may not be for another. And that's the subjectivity. And I think the artful application of this science.
I was recently in one of our hospitals in the UK.
Yeah.
And I was speaking to somebody that I know that works as a nurse in the hospital. And she was saying that post-pandemic, it's always busy in our hospitals, unfortunately, but post-pandemic, they're seeing, one of the reasons they're particularly busy is because they're seeing a lot more younger people admitted to hospital, and primarily it's for mental illness. So she's not a mental health nurse, but this is a general. So this isn't even sort of the psychiatric units. This is a general hospital. So they're seeing a lot more of post-pandemic younger people going to hospital suffering from these type of mental illness challenges. And I'm not an expert in terms of what mental illness is or how you qualify that, but that's what they're seeing.
I think that's ubiquitous. I think it's the same in the States as well. Okay. And most treatment facilities are overwhelmed. Most therapists are overwhelmed. It's hard to even get an appointment. Sometimes it takes months.
Yeah, so I think the same here, I believe.
And by the way, that's not addressing the underlying stigma of getting help. But athletes are notoriously bad at that. The access rates are very low because there's still a stigma around this.
Yeah, and I think that definitely in certain sports in the UK, that's definitely the case, where I think it is getting I think in the last few years, I think it's more acceptable, maybe not completely, but I think it's more acceptable seems like a bad word, but it's the word that comes to mind that's more acceptable. If you are feeling mentally run down or you don't feel 100%, I don't know this exclusively, but I believe that there are some sports institutions that are making it, they know they've got work to do, but I think they are making it a little bit more easier for athletes to actually go and speak to somebody. But I'm not sure that, I think it's an exercise for sports institution as well, because maybe they don't actually have that level of expertise within their business. So for them, I believe it's an exercise where they actually have to do some homework themselves.
The hardest thing with this is like systemically within an organization is proving ROI. I think we're constantly trying to do that because it's very hard to measure that if you're just looking at it to objectify it or concretize it, right? How can I prove what doesn't happen? How can I prove my proactive approach is keeping people out of the treatment room? Yeah. These are the conversations we have in sport all the time, and I feel like we're constantly trying to justify our existence to upper management. So, I've had people ask me, "What exactly do you do here every day? I know we have to have you here, but I don't understand what you do." To this day, I'm still having these conversations. It's getting better, across sports and sports at different, I think, at different paces and there are different developmental processes. We're moving in the right direction as more athletes speak out, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. That's why we're doing what we're doing. We're trying to scale it because it's just not happening at a rate that's fast enough.
And isn't that part of the problem? Because somebody should you have to prove ROI on somebody's health, on somebody's mental well-being? That's almost like the wrong question. It's almost like, let's look at our staff. Let's make sure our staff are fit, not just physically fit, they're mentally fit. Let's make sure that we've got the right infrastructure within our business. Is that the wrong question? The ROI question. ROI is important in business, but when I don't know, it feels to me if we're talking about your staff's well-being, the ROI will come, but you shouldn't ask. I don't know. It feels a little bit odd to place ROI.
Yeah, it's the real questions that we have. But the problem is who's the decision maker, and often it ends up being a light item. Sometimes I feel like I joke. I say, we're right in line with the organic peanut butter. Do we really need organic peanut butter? Nah, let's give them Jiffy. Do we really need that mental skills coach or two? Oh, no, it's just costing too much. We don't, it's getting decision makers, stakeholders that really do care and understand what we're trying to do here. And that starts from the top down.
Okay. You've answered one of my questions, which is going to be, if we're looking at anti-fragility, flourishing, in order to actually, if there are people listening to this that maybe sit within your organization, but ideally at the top, we need to get those people on board. So it can cascade down to all the different strands of a business.
Yes. I was going to mention that a little earlier for a similar question, just in terms of like framing action steps.
Yeah.
It's really critical to understand that everyone has to be involved anytime we're talking about shifting culture in a way that maximizes human potential and minimizes burnout. Right.
Yeah.
And so what that means is, on a we level, like a collective level, it's the policies, it's the practices, it's what you allow, it's what you encourage, it's the language that you use as a leader. Maybe it's even personal practices to a certain extent that you exemplify. Right. All of those we level things matter. And this is really important for the phrasing that Adam brought up earlier, like making sure you don't talk about well-being and anti-fragility while having this unrelenting environment that people can't navigate. Mm-hmm. That's going to work against the message. It's going to make your problems even worse. Right. So all of that's true. And it is never just on our environment or our circumstances, right? There is almost always something that we as individuals can do to try to improve the circumstances and or make sense of them, relate to them, and navigate them somewhat differently. It's a both and, right? So I say this because a lot of times you might talk with coaches or CEOs or whatever it might be, and they be pointing the finger, like, our people got to toughen up, they got to be better performers, those sorts of things. And what do you think the other folks are doing? They're pointing the finger like, hey, it's all like the policies, the practices, this thing's got to change. And usually it's not anytime there's a relationship issue, it's not a me problem, it's not a you problem, it's an us problem. And that's certainly the case with these sorts of circumstances more often than not. Everyone's got to kind of get involved here to move a culture in the right direction.
I was thinking around, if you're a company and you're looking at peak performance, what does peak performance mean? Is it mean that you're performing at your very best?
Can we be clear about that?
Yeah. Yes, please.
We're just that same. I was just talking to, like I said, SFPD about this. Like, it's not constant best performance. Like, what comes after a peak? Literally, what comes after a peak? A valley.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Some sort of lull, some sort of drop. What we're talking about when we refer to, and we don't love this word optimizing, but simple word here. If we're trying to prioritize performance in a way that nudges us to optimize behaviors, then we are optimizing those for kind of the most consistent likelihood that we will reach peak performance when we need to. And then we'll cycle back. Okay. And we'll get into homeostasis and we'll recover and we'll get back into those behaviors. And then ideally, when we need to peak again, we will peak again. If we are asking somebody to stay at that peak relentlessly, to use Adam's word again, right, without that sort of cyclical nature and that recovery and all those sorts of things, that's one indicator, very clear indicator that they are going to fizzle out or burn out.
Yeah. Okay. That's really
In
interesting.
a simple way I put it, when I talk about peak performance, basically peak performance are the highlight reels. Right, once in a
Okay.
while,
Okay.
outperformance is the day-to-day craft in terms of what you have, how I show up day
Yeah.
to day, and sustainability is the long game. It's all of it,
Yeah.
right? So yeah,
So, okay, that's really interesting for me because I didn't know what peak performance meant. So now I know. So, do you think that that word is banded about a lot and people don't actually know what it means? So,
Yes.
okay, okay,
That's why we were ready to answer it.
okay.
Yes.
yep,
And listen, and I'm not trying to point fingers. I've been guilty
Mm,
of it in the past as well. And I think that's why we're trying to be a little more nuanced, is that the whether it's a miscommunication or not, people walking away with the impression that they can be at quote unquote peak performance all the time
mm.
is unhealthy. That's not a message we want to send.
And okay, okay. Again, that's really helpful, really useful because there will be probably senior executive managers that use that terminology in relation to their staff, but or even maybe it's what maybe they're using that term incorrectly in relation to themselves in terms of their own performance. And when their performance dips, as it will do, then maybe they have an unrealistic expectation about, why did that happen? It's really interesting to have a far better understanding about what peak performance is.
Yeah.
So,
agreed.
so just in relation to, I'm conscious of your time, so we'll wrap up shortly.
Yeah.
In terms of anti-fragility, in terms of peak performance, so anti-fragility, I'm sure I listened somewhere around. You are giving us that foundational support and helping us become more robust dealing with things like stress. So when we're able to take when we've got that foundational ability to cope with those difficult moments, I would imagine that's going to help performance. I don't know who wants to
When
take.
when you have the capacity, you feel like you have the tools. All of a sudden, the threat, otherwise, the threat that that you feel when some kind of adversity approaches you, can be reframed to a challenge. You got to feel like you have the tools in place to deal with it because it's the assessment of that threat which will ultimately bring us down and cause the anxiety.
Okay.
That's why training is so important. It's not the initial fear response. That's impulse. That's underlying. That's unconscious. It's impulsive. You can't control that. It's a secondary assessment. Do I have the tools in place to deal what's coming? And that can be trained.
There is, there is no
Yeah.
peak performance without distress.
Period.
Okay.
It's going to be
Okay.
there. We're not trying to get rid of it at all.
Yeah. Okay. This is really fascinating. I could talk to you guys all day. Really fascinating stuff. So anti-fragility. If there are people listening to this and want to know more, where's the best place for people to find you?
Yeah, just check out our website. Really easy. The Antifragile, one word, academy.com, the antifragileacademy.com. You can get in touch with Adam and I there. You can follow us on social, really Instagram and LinkedIn, where we're a little more active around some of the research and the insights and kind of their nerdier elements of this. We're happy to chat with whomever is interested in learning more.
Okay, lovely, lovely. Okay, and I do have a last question, which is the recurring question. If the
Mm.
recurring question is, if you can invite three inspirational people for dinner, they can be alive or past. Who might you invite? Adam, do you want to go first?
Yeah. So I'll make it quick, right? I'm going to stay with my top minds in philosophy bucket, right?
Okay.
First with Marcus Aurelius,
Yeah.
right? He was a Roman emperor and philosopher. Read his Meditations if you have not, kind of the foundation of Stoicism. Two would be Friedrich Nietzsche, one of my favorite existentialists, and I would argue be the founder of Anti-Fragility. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger if you train it properly. And last, I would say, just because a love in my heart for William James, who was one of the American founders of American psychology, and he really did bridge the gap between philosophy and psychology, and studied some really interesting things like a will to believe and some spiritual aspects that go beyond just the typical measurement parts of philosophy that I think we're so familiar with.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And Nick, your turn.
So I went Aristotle. So my dissertation's on an old Aristotelian term called eudaimonia or eudaimonia. It's particularly like meaning based, if you will, form of happiness or well-being. He's responsible for a lot of kind of different ideas that I think served as philosophical foundations for later psychological constructs. Adam's a big fan of his as well, so that was an easy one. This individual passed a few years ago, unfortunately, Sir Ken Robinson. He's got the most popular TED Talk ever offered. Yeah, he's wonderful. His TED Talk was a lot of the inspiration for me eventually going back for a master's and then eventually my doctorate when I was working in education. Love to have a sit down with him. I struggled with the third one, but I'd probably just go kind of one of my more favorite athletes, and that could be. We talked a little bit about Thierry Henry earlier as an Arsenal fan, but as an '80s kid growing up in Michigan, the bad boys of NBA basketball was my first sports memory, and so Joe Dumars is a guy I would love to like sit and chat with. Yeah.
Okay, guys. Conscious I've gone over time, but really appreciate your time today. Really fascinating stuff here. Hopefully we can do this again because I feel that I could talk for you like for days. So thank you so much.
Appreciate you having us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Paul.
And you're welcome. Thank you everybody for tuning into this episode of My Perfect Failure. If you're watching on YouTube, please do hit the subscribe button. It's a great way for us to grow the channel. And your feedback is most welcome. So we're keen to hear about the things you like and equally things you don't like. So until the next time, take care for now. Bye.
Thanks for listening to My Perfect Failure podcast. Be sure to visit www.myperfectfailure.com to join the conversation. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or Google Play. Look out for our next episode.